the invitation to speak here. It seems like it was about a year ago when I set this up with Tracy, and it's hard to believe that that year went by so fast, and it's back to being fall again. And this is the best time of year for me to give this presentation on the hunt, on the history of deer hunting in Wisconsin. I wonder if they are perfect. Thanks. I'll just do this. Let's see. I was saying I have a lot of animations in here at the beginning, and then I don't have so many towards the end, but you could go through a couple. Next one and next one. So just a little bit of background. I'm going to be talking about the history of deer hunting in Wisconsin based on a book I wrote about 10 years ago now. But it still is a pretty popular book, and this time of year I still have 3 or 4 speaking engagements even after 10 years of the book being out. But just a little history real quick on how the book came about. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but freelance outdoor writing has always been a hobby of mine. And I started writing for Wisconsin Outdoor News, which a lot of you may know. It comes out every other week, and it's a pretty popular newspaper about the outdoors in Wisconsin. And I talked to the editor about writing. I'd always wanted to write something about a day in the life of deer hunting in 1901 or something like that. And he suggested I expand a little bit, and we did the whole century of deer hunting in the 1900s. 1 article per decade. So it was pretty limited, but I had a lot of information about the history of deer hunting just from that, researching the century of deer hunting in Wisconsin. Dean Bortz, the editor of Outdoor News, we had talked about making it into a book. They weren't really into books at that time, even though now they have published some books. But I began working with the Wisconsin Historical Society Press a few years after that, after those 10 articles. And they were just getting into more outdoor sporting type things. They had focused on other aspects of Wisconsin history, and somebody, right before I came around, somebody had just done a biography of Gordon McQuarrie, who the old Duck Hunters Association, a lot of you may be familiar. If you're not familiar with Gordon McQuarrie, find some books and read him, because he's often thought of as the first professional outdoor writer in the country, because he wrote for the Milwaukee Journal as a paid outdoor writer. And apparently there weren't any jobs like that before Gordon. So the Historical Society was open to publishing a book like this. It took me another 5 years to gather up all the information and write the book itself. Even though I had that core century of deer hunting history, the press wanted me to go back farther into history and bring it up to modern day history too. So that took me about 5 more years. Sure. Like I said, the book, we expanded the scope. So I went way back. I went back to where deer hunting history began.
Sure.
So I have a lot of information I'm going to go through, and if you have questions, ask away, so that we don't forget about the questions at the end of the presentation, because I'll move on to lots of different stuff. What I found out through 5 more years of research and the century of deer hunting history research I'd already done was, in my mind, the answer to the question, why is deer hunting such a big deal in Wisconsin? We all know, maybe not as much today as it was in the past, but even today deer hunting is still a big thing. It's a big phenomenon. We still have kids taking the week of deer season off. It still coincides with Thanksgiving like it has for decades. So I think I answered that question, and at the end you can judge if I did or not. Slide. You could go through probably 3, another, and 1 more. So early naturalist, turn of the century, in the early 1900s, Ernest Thompson Seton wrote a lot of wildlife type books. He wrote that the whitetail is the American deer of the past and the American deer of the future. And he may not have realized it, or maybe he did, how really precise that definition is. Slide. The white-tailed deer is truly an American deer. Some wildlife species we have in North America came from Asia. They migrated over the Bering Sea land bridge, which I'll talk about in a second or in a minute. But the whitetail completely evolved in North America. Early ancestors to the white-tailed deer crossed into North America from Eurasia, Asia, and Europe. Sometime in the Pliocene epoch, 5.3 to 1.8 million years ago. And probably what came over was something like this. This is a muntjac deer, the picture on the top and the diagram, the drawing on the bottom. And they are the most ancient deer species on Earth. And they're really strange. They're a crossover. They have tusks, like early deer had tusks and not antlers. They use tusks for defense, and same kind of reason whitetails have antlers, but they also had little tiny antlers too. So they're regarded as the species between really ancient deer species and modern deer species. So they probably migrated from on the Bering Sea land bridge a few million years ago. The interesting thing about these muntjac deer is they have the lowest chromosome level of, it's compared to fruit flies. They only have like 8 genes, which is really amazing, but it may have been a good thing for developing into other species. So once these types of deer came over to North America, one branch developed, kind of a northern-based branch, developed into the white-tailed deer. Mule deer and black-tailed deer are other species that may have come from the same origin. Slide, please. You could go through a couple more. One more. So, deer, white-tailed deer really evolved during the Pleistocene epoch, about 2.5 to 1.5 million years ago. And the Pleistocene is the ice ages, the recurrent ice ages coming and going of the ice sheets in North America. And it was really a bizarre time with strange animals. Climate change was, every million years or so there was ice that covered North America, then it receded, and it looked a lot like this when there was no ice. Wisconsin or the western United States may have looked like this. And white-tailed deer were evolving under a lot of pressure from herbivores, other animals like deer that eat vegetation, but also a huge variety of predators. And that is what created the whitetail we know today. Slide, please. So the Pleistocene is a time of megafauna. We had a lot of large animals that are all extinct now. There was a beaver, the giant beaver it's called, that was as big as a bear, may have weighed 200 pounds. There were all these large versions of animals we know today, but there were also animals in North America that might be familiar to us as African animals. There was a North American giraffe, there's a North American lion, and compared to the small number of predators we have today, it was a predator warehouse basically. There are predators everywhere. The dire wolf, bigger than a gray wolf with a jaw strength 10 times bigger than gray wolves, many times bigger at least than gray wolves. Probably heard about dire wolves. They were good at preying on the herbivores. Next slide. Mentioned the American lion, another ancient deer predator. Next slide. And then the white-tailed competitors. This is what North America, these are species that were present in North America up to about 13,000 years ago. So really in geological time, these species were around not that long ago. So herbivores included antelope, and there was North American camels, wild horses, different types of wild horses. So the whitetail had to compete with all these herbivores because there's only a limited amount of food while staying safe from all the predators that were out there. So it was a pretty big task. Like I said, most of these species from the Pleistocene are extinct now. Slide, please.
Is that one by the tree a giant beaver?
I think it's a sloth or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the right side of the tree, what about the left side of the tree?
I think that's a sloth. I don't know. I'm not
Just
sure
had
what
to
the thing
ask.
on the right is.
Yeah, I know, it's funny looking.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's an American camel. There are different kinds of horses. And horses went extinct in North America, but they thrived in Asia and Europe, and then they came back with the Spanish, and yeah, horses now.
Okay, next one.
You could go a couple more. So, while other species went extinct, the whitetail though flourished, because deer evolved to be adaptable and opportunistic, so they could shift to new habitats. If there was one habitat was disappearing because of climate change, they learned to go to something else. So they were adaptable, opportunistic, and they developed, because of the predator pressure, they developed what's been called a security toolbox. And anybody who's hunted white-tailed deer know exactly what this means. They have hearing, smell, and eyesight, and other tools in the toolbox that help them evade predation. So they came this way not because of human hunting, but because of all the predators in the Ice Age. And next slide. Next. So Valerius Geist, he's a famous deer researcher in Canada. He termed it the whitetail was very good at avoiding extinction. And that kind of sums it up. Next slide. This is a video. If you just, I think if there's, is there a cursor maybe? Still. There we go.
Down at the bottom.
Yeah, just click on the arrow on that, yeah. So this isn't the greatest video. I took it a few years back, but it shows the security toolbox. The big ears, always alert, always popping its head up. And it also shows the diversity in habitat too. It's eating grass here. I had another video that I must have taken out, but showing that a deer, anybody who's watched deer while you're hunting, or just at your house or something, a deer will munch a little bit here on leaves, then eat some grass, then go back to leaves or maybe some forbs. So they're always changing what they're eating. And that's that adaptability of habitats. They're any kind of vegetation, they have their favorites, and the deer's eyesight has evolved for evading predation too. The eyes are really set forward, and they don't have 360-degree eyesight, but I forget what it is, but it's 200-something degree eyesight, where they actually see on the sides of their heads. And because of that, they have real trouble with stereo or seeing 3D images. So a lot of times you'll see a deer go like that when they're looking at something, because they can't quite have that 3D like humans do. They kind of have more of a two-dimensional view, but it helps because they can see, basically almost totally around themselves. Slide. So that's the beginning of the deer. So we can't have the history of deer hunting in Wisconsin without the species. So we know where deer came from, and now we have the hunter. Humans arrived in North America as the last ice age was receding about 13,000 years ago. And that was because the Bering land bridge allowed travel before the last ice age between Siberia and the continent is called Varingia at that time. So all that that's kind of that light yellow was land, exposed because sea levels were down. So there's kind of a corridor between the ice and the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, that allowed these species allowed people from Asia to migrate to North America. There was a lot of this land bridge had been exposed during multiple ice ages, but it was this last one where there were people in Asia by this time that allowed people to come to North America. And the wildlife species would go back and forth, but probably people were following the big game as it moved from Asia into North America. And there's a lot of different theories, but this one still holds up, that people probably came across, in Alaska, and within a few thousand years, very quickly dispersed across North America and into South America. Slide. So the relationship between the human hunter and the whitetail began as soon as man entered the scene, because whitetail was here, waiting for humans, kind of, or here before humans got here. And the Paleo Indians, the first hunters, the first, paleo means first, so the first people coming to North America were very reliant on big game. There's more research being done where they were probably more diversified than we think. It used to be that Paleo Indians were 100% big game hunters, but now geologists, anthropologists feel that they were probably more similar to today's Native Americans, or Native Americans, within the past 1,000 years or so. So anyway, they were hunters though, and they were hunting the Megafauna, these big animals that existed in North America in the Pleistocene. They used primarily the atlatl or atlatl, depending on how you want to pronounce it, the spear thrower, and it was a pretty ingenious piece of technology. Just a little small thing, the spear rested on it, and it increases the potential energy of the spear by, I don't know how much, but huge amount, so that the spear is flying faster than a person could throw it. So it was something, there's a lot of people that use these today, and there's some states that allow this primitive hunting where you can use a atlatl for hunting. So that was the main way the Paleo Indians hunted big game. Slide please. So we know that as the last ice age was receding, climate was changing. These megafauna, the mastodons and the mammoths and the camels and giraffes, they all went extinct. But some species remained. White-tailed deer was one, elk remained, moose remained, antelope, pronghorn antelope. So there's some species that were around during the Ice Age that we still have today. But as the big megafauna disappeared, the whitetail and these other other big game species became a lot more important to the Paleo Indians. Slide. You could go a couple. One more. Yep. And then as the Paleo Indians developed into different cultures and different tribes, white-tailed deer were still important. At a lot of sites in the Midwest, a lot of ancient Indian sites that archaeologists have found. Oftentimes the bones of the white-tailed deer are the most prevalent bones found at old cooking sites or old butchering sites. So they were really important right from the get-go. White-tailed deer were important to the Paleo Indians and then the Indian cultures that followed. And the Paleo Indians or the following cultures became less nomadic, less moving around all the place. Archaic period is a period that followed the Paleo Indians. They were adapting to a different climate than what the Paleo Indians saw. And interestingly, The bow and arrow was an ancient weapon in Asia and Europe, but it's only evidence of Indians in North America using the bow and arrow from about 1,500 years ago. So it probably developed independently of Asia and Europe. So even, 1,500 years ago, even the early Romans and the early Greeks that were using bow and arrow, they were not. It was not even developed in North America. Slightly. So now we have contact with the Europeans. Nicolay arrived in Wisconsin in 1634, and probably before this, the Indian tribes in Wisconsin knew about the French just from down the line trading with other tribes. But the first French person, at least recorded history, to set foot in Wisconsin was Nicolay in July of 1634 near Green Bay. Slide, please. You could go a couple here too. One more. So Native American culture is counted by the French. There are several tribes that existed in Wisconsin at that time. They all had a lot in common. They utilized the wealth of the natural resources available in Wisconsin, including wild rice, nuts and roots. A lot of Wisconsin tribes were really dependent on sugar made from maple trees. They traveled on foot, but especially northern Wisconsin tribes, the Ojibwe, were very good birch bark canoe makers, which the French, when they came to North America, they were astounded by the birch bark canoe. And if you've ever seen a birch bark canoe up close, it's really an amazing piece of equipment that's made completely from the woods. It's light, but it's sturdy, it's engineered, just remarkable. So the French, integrated themselves into Indian society through the fur trade. Slide. And all the tribes had those things in common, plus they were deer hunters. Slide. Go a couple. One more. And the whitetail is a perfect animal for subsistence. And they were crucial to the survival of families, of tribes in Wisconsin, particularly the northern tribes like the Ojibwe. Whitetail provided food, material for clothing, material for tools. Didn't migrate out of the region in the fall like waterfowl did. There were only certain times of the year where fishing was really a productive activity. Bears, although they could find bears in the winter, they weren't as easy to hunt. And deer were easily transported and processed. One person, one hunter, could drag a deer back to camp. Generally, it was the women who do the processing. The deer was easy to process, easy to tan the hides for clothing. It was just a very useful and important animal for the early hunters, the early tribal hunters. Slide. You go one more. This one. Like I mentioned, the Ojibwe, they originally came from Sault Ste. Marie area, moved into northern Wisconsin. Back then, the deer population was pretty low in Wisconsin, especially in northern Wisconsin, where there's big pine trees and not great deer habitat. So Robert Beater, he's an anthropologist from Wisconsin. Despite summer fishing and hunting, there was seldom enough food. They did know, tribes knew how to save food. They made birch bark baskets for maple syrup sugar, but it was seldom enough to last through the long winter. So in the fall, they would break up into bands and they would go to their kind of allocated hunting areas. And that's why the hunter in the tribal bands was so important, because he was the link between life and death. If the hunter wasn't successful in the winter, a tribe could starve to death, or a family band could starve to death, or at least be very sick. Slide, please. So the European influence on Native American deer hunter was embodied in the new weapons that were available. So when the French arrived, even though the tribes in Wisconsin may have already known about the fur trade, Nicolet went away for a while, and it was several decades later that actual fur traders came to Wisconsin. Kind of late as far as the whole European fur trade goes, because getting around the Great Lakes and getting to Green Bay was not that easy. So Wisconsin was kind of protected by Lake Michigan. But the French did arrive, and the French and the tribes, became completely incorporated into a new culture of the fur trade. Slide, please. So it's, I don't know if exploitation is the right word, but it's kind of the first heavy use of wildlife for commercial purposes. Before the French, there was some trading going on with tribes, between tribes. There's evidence of seashells and things from different parts of the country in Wisconsin before there was the French or the English fur trade. So the tribes did trade, and fur definitely was probably traded, and deer hides and things like that. But we kind of think of the fur trade as the beaver fur trade, but lots of different furs were traded and were valuable, even muskrats and deer and elk hides and buffalo hides farther west were a very important part of the fur trade. A sought after commodity. There wasn't the agricultural production even in Europe at this time that we have today, and so there wasn't leather. It was easier to get leather from deer, and it was cost effective to get leather from deer in North America than in Europe itself. So deer hides from deer killed in Wisconsin ended up as gloves or shoes in Paris or London. Hundreds of different clothing items came from deer. Even buttons were made from deer bones. And I don't think I have a slide of this, but George Washington, if you think of the British or the American British uniform, they have white leggings, white pants. Those were made from deer hide. So for centuries, deer hide was important. The relentless North American fur and hide trade, a couple centuries of a colonial fur and hide trade, took its number on many species. Know about the beaver, but including white-tailed deer, and numbers of deer in Wisconsin were greatly diminished by the early 1800s. Slide, please. This is just something maybe a little overly romantic, but something John James Audubon, another painter and famous naturalist, kind of lamenting the end of the Indians' subsistence hunting. So, next slide. You go one more. Maybe one more. No, sorry. So things began to change. There was a lot of stress between the French were defeated by the British in the 1760s. The British took over the fur trade in the Great Lakes area, and then the British lost the Revolutionary War. They still kind of hung out in the Great Lakes conducting the fur trade until the War of 1812, and we finally got the British out of all the forts in the Great Lakes area. So the fur trade, actually the Americans taking over the fur trade was really symbolic for the Americans coming into the Wisconsin region and changing it from this fur trade economy that lasted for 200 years to an agricultural economy. So the Americans, John Jacob Astor, the American Fur Company, they ran fur trade for a little bit, but finally the fur trade gave way to settlement. So at the turn of the century, from the 17th to 1800s, there really was not the profitability of the fur trade like there had been. The hide trade all but disappeared. Deer numbers in Wisconsin then began to rebound in the early 1800s. Slightly. Which was good timing. Kind of a reprieve from the fur trade. Deer numbers began to kind of rebound. And then we have, 1830s, 1840s was really the influx of pioneer settlers. And they were kind of new subsistence hunters until they became established, farmers became established. The early pioneers that were breaking ground on the prairie. By 1840, it's just 31,000 people in Wisconsin territory. So deer were important for the early pioneers. Put meat on the table, important source of protein and clothing too. So just like with the tribes, the importance of deer and subsistence hunting was important for the pioneers until farms got established and livestock became more prevalent. Slide. So then, one more. That's it. So moving on into the 1800s, settlement of the state really was advancing, early 1800s, and up to the Civil War. Roads and railroads were linking Wisconsin towns. And deer hunting became again going from a subsistence activity to a commercial activity again. And there's good enough deer populations to do this. And it coincided with market hunting. A lot of times you think of market hunting with waterfowl, but market hunting was the unrestricted slaughter, basically, of any kind of wildlife because there was money in it. Wildlife was sold for different reasons. Birds were killed for decorations on hats. Primarily, most of it was food related. Anything that could be eaten as game animal was basically killed. The waterfowl hunting is the most famous because we think of the sink boats that people had on Lake Winnebago and the Great Lakes. This occurred in Wisconsin, and the big, huge guns that they used, just to kill as much as possible with as few resources as possible. That was the goal of the market hunter. And after the Civil War, it really took off because the invention of refrigerated rail cars allowed this game, this unregulated slaughter of game, including deer. It allowed that food, it allowed a bigger market of food to get to Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul. So it really intensified this market hunting period. Slide. And I don't know if you can read this, but this is a menu from John B. Drake, the Drake Hotel owner in Chicago, put on an annual game dinner at Thanksgiving. This was from 1886, and I just put arrows where there's venison. But you can see all the other things that are on there too. Just red-winged starlings, red-winged blackbirds was part of the menu. Marsh birds, gray squirrels, buffalo steak, rabbits. And I may have missed them, but at least 5 different dishes made out of deer. So the market hunters would just kill as much as they could. They would ship just the saddles of the deer, just the really meat rear portions, called saddles. They would be shipped by the thousands. I don't think I have this in the slideshow, but in the book I have some records from the number of deer being shipped from certain places in Wisconsin to, say, St. Paul or Minneapolis, and it's just astounding, the numbers. So deer were just really stalked after and sought after, really put a damper on the population growth. Slide. The market hunting led to the extinction of what's been termed the most populous bird on earth, the passenger pigeon. And Wisconsin probably had the largest, according to A.W. Shorter, who was an early historian of he was a wildlife biologist and early historian of wildlife. He thinks the largest roosting population of passenger pigeons in the world occurred in Wisconsin. There were some big ones in Michigan and Indiana and other states, but and this is off the subject, but people would talk about watching things like this for hours, watching the procession of passenger pigeons for hours. And the market hunters, they would kill passenger pigeons, put them in barrels, salted barrels, and they would be shipped to the cities, maybe even to New York. And they went extinct. Slide, please. One more. So the market hunting took its toll. By the late 1800s, deer, there's a lot of people that thought deer were going to go extinct, buffalo, elk, just because of this market hunting. And buffalo almost did go extinct. By the turn of the century, there were just very few buffalo in North America, and they were all on private preserves. And people just kind of assumed that was going to happen and we weren't going to have deer. So this shows there's still deer in the crosshatch counties, but southern Wisconsin really had no deer at this time. Slide, please. In northern Wisconsin, it was a little different. The cutting of the pineries, the big pine trees, actually benefited white-tailed deer because they like that browsy, early vegetational habitat. And the big trees had all shade, there wasn't a lot of undergrowth. That wasn't great wildlife habitat, or it wasn't great deer habitat. But when they cut all the pine trees down, created the cutover and really good white-tailed deer habitat up north. Slide. So towards the end of the 1800s, thankfully, people were realizing that there was a reason to keep these wildlife species around. And this conservation mentality started to develop kind of after the Civil War, up through the turn of the century. I think everybody may know that Theodore Roosevelt was a big proponent of conservation. He, with other people, founded the Boone and Crockett Club. And he did a lot for protecting habitat. He supported the beginning of the U.S. Forest Service system, promoted the idea of public lands and conservation. So you got market hunting coming to a close at the turn of the century. National legislation was passed where, can't remember the name of the act, in 1901, made it illegal to transport illegally killed game across state borders. So the market hunters were illegally killing game, but they could no longer, it was illegal to ship game outside of a state border. So that really is kind of credited with putting the end to market hunting. Slide, please. So we have the mentality shifting from wildlife as being a commercial species that anybody could take to being a public resource that had to be, that the take of the public resources, the public resource was regulated. So this is the rise of the sportsman, where it was realized that, and Roosevelt again was a big proponent of this, that there was enjoyment in big game hunting for recreational purposes and not always for commercial purposes. So we see this shift to where in Wisconsin in the late 1800s there started to be state game regulations. They were pretty open at first, really long seasons, but even during the long seasons it was pretty much limited to 2 deer. And in the book I have an appendix that shows all the regulated hunting seasons, what they were. Used to be any 2 deer early on. So you think of where the deer were in Wisconsin at the turn of the century. They were in northern Wisconsin. So the development of the sport hunting in Wisconsin began as a northern Wisconsin thing. And you see a lot of these photos around of these first early Wisconsin deer hunting camps towards the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. Slightly. So this really became, because you would have to go away from home, you couldn't hunt out your backyard unless you lived in Hayward or Minocqua, and not a lot of people really lived there at that time. You had to get on a train, plan out maybe a 2-week trip, and stay in a camp. So this is where the deer camp tradition began. Slide, please. One more. Yep. So downstate hunters from towns and villages in central and southern Wisconsin would hop on a train, plan out their trip, and the train would stop where they wanted to, where they asked to be dropped off at or picked up at. Slide. So the old logging camps became deer camps. Like not sure what the one on the right is. People would just build their own camps. Some people would tent, in big canvas tents. Slide, please. Not sure what.
Oops, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Not sure what this is. If that was somebody that built an old structure from a logging camp, or if they just built their own. But one thing about this slide is you can see there's no trees really. This is turn of the century cut over, and fairly good deer hunting. Slide. There were motels. Rhinelander, but by the end of the 1800s, Rhinelander had hotels. Minocqua, Hayward, they all had hotels because there was the thriving logging business. There wasn't much for agriculture at that time, but there were offices. Logging companies had offices. So hunters started staying in hotels. They'd pay $1 for somebody to haul them out to a hunting camp somewhere in a wagon. Slide. One thing about these old photos is that's fine. You could go to any of these. They're all posed because the photography at the time. They did have box cameras by the end of the 1800s, but most of these were taken by a professional photographer. So everybody's posing with their deer at the end of the hunt. A lot of photos will be like a photo card that has the name of the photographer. It seemed like Medford and Ashland, they had a lot of professional photographers, not a lot, but the same professional photographers taking deer camp pictures. Slide. So they all kind of look the same. Everybody's got their hunting face on, and you can just see the size of the deer and the racks, the bucks. Slide. This is one of the few that I actually know about. There's Goodagast Creek right outside Rhinelander, and John Goodagast was a famous, if he was into real estate, I think logging originally, maybe then real estate, but just pretty good meat pole. Slide. This is just something. As long as men have hunted, they have banded into special hunting packs with their own taboos, traditions, and rituals. This is something I got out of a Winchester deer hunting book. And it just kind of symbolizes that the deer camp, that's where a lot of these funny traditions and, that were passed on to generation after generation. That's where they began because, you were there with your hunting partners for a week or two before you went home. So I think that's kind of neat where the hunting camp traditions began. Slide. Downstate hunters took deer home by rail, just like they got up to the North Woods. And scenes like this is really nothing. This is a Harshout, not too far from up to the west of Rhinelander. That's just a couple deer, but some photos show piles and piles of deer. And the northern Wisconsin residents started to resent that, that the southern hunters, and it's still the north-south thing today, but the southern hunters were coming up and taking all their deer. And that becomes important in the future. Slide, please. So deer hunting was becoming more popular. I guess I'm jumping up to, I guess I have this slide in here because cars, by the, this is 1927 game laws, by the early 1900s, there were more roads in the state. You didn't have to always take the train. So hunters were coming up with, in automobiles, slide. During the Great Depression, people were still hunting. I have all the hunting numbers in the book too, but this is just a quote from the New North, a newspaper in Rhinelander in 1930. Slide. And this is another change. The resort industry really took off in northern Wisconsin, late 1800s, early 1900s. So now we have deer hunters staying at resorts. This is a resort by Tomahawk. Shows, you know, you could drive up to a resort and you didn't really have to stay for 2 weeks in a hunting camp. You could come up for a few days, actually, you know, if you wanted to. So things were changing that way by the 1930s. Slide. So all these deer going south, you know, we really had a limited deer range in the early 1900s, 20s, and 30s. The resort owners actually became worried about, most people came to a resort to see the wildlife, not for deer hunting in the fall. So the resort owners started banding together against deer hunting, feeling that too many deer were being killed during the hunting season, too many deer were killed, and then, you know, they go south because of the influx of all these southern hunters. So there became a real save the deer attitude, mostly in northern Wisconsin, by the 1920s. And it also reflects that the deer populations in central and southern Wisconsin were virtually non-existent. So northern Wisconsin residents wanted to preserve their deer herd. So kind of statewide, you see a save the deer mentality, and then especially in the northern region, you see this too. So a couple things were going on here. Beginning 1932, in central and southern Wisconsin, the counties were closed completely to deer hunting. And it started out a few counties and it expanded. I'm not sure what there was a peak of closed counties. I'm not sure how many that was. And then that was county-wide. And then statewide, there was alternate closed seasons from 1925 to 1935, where one year there was no deer hunting at all in the state. And then the next year there was deer hunting, but not in the closed counties, only in the open counties. And then especially in the north, there was the expansion of the deer refuge idea, where the state would designate large tracts of land, public land, where there could be no hunting. And it was designated, that's a sign from that era. It was designated as no hunting. So there was multiple things going on to help stabilize and support an increase. The season dates changed. One of the shortest seasons in history was 1937, where it was only a 3-day season. Slide. So this is 1929, kind of an estimate. It was really hard for the state to estimate deer populations. A lot of it was just wardens looking at how many deer were on the railroad platforms, things like that. But it shows that even by 1929, they're estimating no deer in southern Wisconsin, very few in central Wisconsin, and I don't know if they stopped at 1,000, doesn't seem like anything, or 2,000 in Lincoln County. So, you know, the deer were still in the north even by the 1930s, really. Slide. We're talking about bow hunting. This is it's kind of an aside, but I talk about bow hunting in the book where Wisconsin was really a leader in the establishment of a regulated bow hunting season. 1930, the same time period, even though there was a save the deer thing, there were counties that had too many deer. There was crop damage in Columbia and Sauk counties. So the first separate archery season in 1934 was held in Columbia and Sauk counties. 1937, the archers had lobbied for a longer season, and 1937 they got a 20-day early season, and it expanded from there. That's Roy Case, who was talking about, I think he had to leave. He was there, yeah. He was with the Wisconsin Bow Hunters Association, but Roy Case with Case Implements, or the company Case, is credited with shooting the first deer in a regulated archery season. And I think in the country, definitely in Wisconsin, and that is the deer. So moving along, we get into the 1940s. Deer populations were going up because of all the save the deer efforts. 1940, the war years, still increasing number of hunters. 1943 was the infamous split season where antlerless deer were allowed to be shot for the first time in decades. The save the deer attitude kind of led to buck-only seasons for a long, long time. I'm going to get to why 1943 is important, but of course, lots of things were rationed during the World War II, especially ammunition. So this shows, I don't know if they're waiting for deer ammunition or shotgun shells or what, but this shows hunters lined up for ammunition in Madison in 1944. Next slide. So while we were having the war in Europe and the Pacific, there was something happening in Wisconsin that's been termed later, it was termed the Deer Wars. The Save the Deer efforts were so successful that deer populations were going up quickly, and Aldo Leopold kind of thought of as the father of wildlife management. He wrote a book called Game Management, early proponent of scientific game management. He felt, and others did too, that the deer were growing faster than the range would support, and they were outstripping the range, and he was identifying deer die-offs in northern Wisconsin where thousands of deer would starve during the winter because they were not managed within the range that would support them. And he received death threats because of these ideas. It was a new thing. People thought he was crazy, but he persevered. This, I won't read it, but Keith McCaffrey, a friend of mine, he's retired DNR deer researcher, lives in Rhinelander. He's explaining what the deer wars were. So Aldo Leopold eventually got the state to agree to antlerless harvest, because antlerless harvest is what controls, what allows deer management to work. And it resulted in that split season. I can't remember which came first. It was either an antlerless season first or a buck-only season first. But there was a few days of an antlerless season, a few days of a buck season. Of course, it resulted in a lot more deer being killed than buck-only seasons. And there was outcry across the state. You know, people thought that that plan was just slaughtering of deer. The game management or deer season went back to buck only for a few more years until, I'm not going to get into step-by-step deer management, but it eventually went to quota deer and to a party permit. A lot of you may remember the party permit system, and then, you know, it progressed to what we saw in the 1980s and 90s. But slide, please. So after World War II, soldiers came back from Europe and the Pacific, And it was a huge surge of outdoor activity, outdoor popularity. Families, became outdoor families, boating, fishing, outboards, everything just surged after the war, including deer hunting. So you can see the jump from licenses sold in 1945 to 1950, just leap after leap. Slide. And this was another, we saw the deer camp traditions that started in the turn of the century. Well, this is when a lot of deer camps that exist today were established in the 1950s, 60s, by the war generation. So we see new things, automobiles, people not really having to go to a camp. They may hunt just for a day or two somewhere, drive somewhere to a state forest or something. Big buck contests, hunters balls, they all kind of started in this time frame. Slide. So we have this surge of new deer camps being started and new traditions, like I said, being developed from this new generation of deer hunters. Slide. So actually, deer hunter numbers continue to really increase, even despite 1970s. We saw a lot of anti-hunting, anti-trapping sentiment develop. 1990 was the record number of regular deer licenses sold. So I think this combines all deer licenses, but it was like 699,000. So we kind of think of the old days as being the heyday of hunting, but didn't compare anything to the number of hunters out in the 1990s when the state deer population was estimated to be in the millions, or at least over a million, and there was ample opportunity during those years, the 90s and into the 2000s. Slide. But we're going to wrap things up now. There's so much to talk about. I kind of breezed through a lot of it. Take a look at the book. I have lots of details in the book. But the one thing we know about Wisconsin deer hunting is change is always just around the corner. You saw it back in the 1880s. People didn't like the changes then. There's always something going on. And more modern, my book ends, the second to last chapter is CWD. So I went into a lot of detail about CWD, and then that was just kind of the early days of CWD. It was discovered in 2002 from a deer killed in 2001. And CWD management has gone back and forth since then. There was a big push at the beginning. There was a lot of pushback by hunters and landowners in the CWD zone, which is around Madison. That bottom right is a CWD committee that was formed not that long ago. There's increased demand for CWD sampling, so that's ever changing. Slide, please. And this was a huge change that occurred after my book. 2008 deer season was kind of a bummer for most hunters, especially the north. There was a lot of outcry, again, more change about deer management. I don't cover this, and I'm not that familiar with it, but Dr. Deer came in with a committee of scientists and made recommendations to DNR Deer Committee. And out of that came the County Deer Advisory Council, where the DNR got rid of the old deer management units. So it went to counties. A county is a deer management unit. Some counties are split between northern regions and farmland regions, but basically this is Door County's CDAC getting together to talk about whether or not to allow antlerless deer hunting. We're back to that again, something we saw back in the 1940s. Counties up by me had refused any, it was buck only until last year, I think, maybe the year before, but since 2008, nearly 10 years of buck only hunting, which we hadn't really seen that since the 1800s, early 1900s. Slide. A lot of people, going a little bit over my hour, but a lot of people have talked about the hunting and trapping and other consumptive uses of wildlife were going to disappear. You know, that there were some predictions. When I was in school at Stevens Point in the when did I go to school? 1980s. So there was a lot of attitude surveys done about hunting and fishing, things like that. And some people predicted that there wasn't going to be deer hunting today, you know, 30, 40 years later. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does a survey, pretty in-depth survey about outdoor activities, and there's some, they break it down by demographics, and there's some really good signs that deer hunting is going to continue. And one demographic is younger females are getting into the sport more than they ever used to. And there are always women hunters, what I found out. And this is a pretty impressive picture from the late 1800s. And I looked at a lot of old newspapers while I was writing the book, and if a female hunter shot a nice deer like that, it would be front page news. Forget what they'd always call a female hunter a modern day, the god of hunting, the Greek god of hunting is a female. I can't remember.
Artemis or Athena?
Yeah.
Diana.
That's it. Yeah. Who said that? Diana?
Diana.
Yeah. They'd always say, modern day Diana slays big buck, or something like that. And so that's part of history, but the Becoming an Outdoors Woman program that started in Stevens Point by Dr. Christine Thomas, I think is still the dean of the college. She was on the Natural Resources Board for a while. But she found out a long time ago that the reason women weren't getting into hunting is because they just didn't know how. They weren't mentored by their fathers or grandfathers like boys were. So they developed this training course, basically, in a non-competitive environment where women are teaching other women bow hunting and shooting skills, and it's been really popular. I think it's been adopted by about every state in the country. So that's a positive thing for deer hunting's future. Slide. So today, the deer hunt is still one of our most enduring institutions. I don't think Brittany knows that I've used this photo. She's probably in her 20s or 30s by now. But I met a man named Louis Falk, who was really excited about my project and took me to his deer camp around north of the Minocqua, north of Woodruff. And the same camp, Crooked Horn Camp, was begun by his father in the 1930s. His father was Columbia County farmer. After the wheat threshing, which was hard work back then, a bunch of farmers thought, let's go up to northern Wisconsin and hunt deer. And they went up there, they cut boughs, balsam boughs for their bed. They had a canvas hung from a tree that they slept under, and they deer hunted. And ever since then, this Crooked Horn Camp was established. And so Louis' dad was Brittany's great-grandfather. Louis was her grandfather, and I met a lot of Louis' sons when I was at their camp. So Louis sent me this photo. He's passed away now. He's from Poinet. Was from Poinet, but he sent me this photo a long, long time ago. But I think it's just neat that Brittany, hunted deer out of the original Emil Falk's original deer camp. So, slide. So this is getting back to what I started with. Why is deer hunting such a big deal in Wisconsin? Well, we know it's important to every community in the state, whether it's a Native American community, big cities, little cities. Deer hunting has an economic impact of millions and millions of dollars, but it's a lot more than that. It's more of it's a cultural phenomenon. slide. And it's just so many different things that go into deer hunting. The deer camps and the idea that deer season begins the Saturday before Thanksgiving. And there's always talk about changing that, and it never gets changed because it's so important that deer hunting and the holidays go together. And it's just been that way. It never used to, you know, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, it never started. That was not something set. But in the 1940s, I think, is when that may have begun, and it's been the same ever since for the regular gun deer season. There's been added hunts here and there, but there's just all the different things, the camaraderie and the family time and the incredible species that the white-tailed deer is, that I hope, you know, just going back that far, you know, I hope gives people maybe new appreciation for the whitetail. You know, the northern white-tailed deer hunt is something envied by people in other states, and you know, there's big game hunting in other states, and the West has elk, and Alaska has elk and bear and moose, but Wisconsin whitetail is still about the best hunt that you can have. So I think that answered my question. You know, why is deer hunting such a big deal? And it's all that, everything I talked about. Slide. So, not many questions during the presentation. Anything now?
Does that prehistoric deer still live around here?
Not in North America. It either, not an expert on evolution, you know, it either developed into other species or developed into other species and the original species went extinct, but it does exist in Asia. In India has muntjac deer. There's different species of muntjac deer in other Asian countries, so it's still around, but not in North America.
Let me ask you a question. I'm having a difficult time wrapping my mind around the fact that there was 31,000 people in this state and we almost had a deer extinction in the southern half. How is it that if they say that a wolf will eat up to 20 deer, we have 1,000 wolves, we have 22,000 car deer accidents a year, and they sell almost 800,000 hunting licenses? What's the tipping point? You know, the DNR doesn't cap the number of people that can get the license. I doubt that 800,000 people will all get a deer, but what's the tipping point when you look at natural attrition because of freezing to death in the winter, car accidents, wolf? You know, what if 500,000 deer were harvested? What's the tipping point where we're back to no deer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a deer biologist, I'm a wildlife biologist, but what I would think is, going back to Aldo Leopold and scientific deer management, what I understand to be true is the quota deer, the antlerless deer, are really the key to managing the population. So we manage, the DNR manages, you know, it's changed, and I don't know a lot about the CDACs, but it used to be, you know, quota deer were based on the health of the range, the winter severity index. So you can raise and lower the quota, the antlerless deer quota. You can raise and lower, that's what you can control. And you want to manage a deer population so it's like a 50-50 sex ratio, 1-to-1 sex ratio. So if the population is lower, you reduce the quota deer. You go, you know, some counties went to buck only because they felt that the population needed to be increased. So it kind of limits itself when you limit the number of quota deer. And like you said, not everybody is successful. The lower the deer numbers, the less success there is. I think the difference between the market hunting years, you know, where that map showed no deer in the south, that was just unrelenting pressure. There was no regulated season from probably even 12 months out of the year they're hunting, because they're hunting for the selling of meat. So now we have regulated seasons, we have regulated quota, the harvest is regulated. I think that's the difference, just we have a handle on scientific management of the deer population. It swing, you know, it's definitely a pendulum. Like it showed in the early 1990s, we did have a huge overpopulation of deer. There was a lot of new things implemented to reduce the deer population then. There was, you know, the bonus deer tags, the earn a buck season that wasn't hugely popular, but it did its job. And then, you know, the pendulum kind of swung maybe the other way. And like I said, I'm not a deer manager, so, but, you know, so things got restricted. Some of those things went away. The earn a buck went away, you know, especially in northern Wisconsin. So there's lots of different variables that we try to manage, but we can't manage weather. So definitely it goes back and forth.
Two things, when on your license sold, does that consider, like if you buy a deer gun license in Waupaca County, the Central Farmland, you get 4 tags. Now, is that considered one license or 4?
Just one license.
Just one license.
Yeah. For most of the more modern years, it's all DNR statistics, and it's one license that has, you have multiple tags.
Yes, regarding the CWD, do you know if a person shoots a buck and wants to bring the head and neck over to Hartman Creek State Park to have it tested? If it's a buck, do you have to leave the horns on, or can you remove the horns? Do you know if there's a requirement one way or the
I
other?
can't say for sure, but I think they will saw the horns off for you, or at least. But, or if you wanted to get it mounted, or
Are you talking just during the testing process or transporting?
During the testing, would you?
Yeah.
Because if you take your deer and drop their head off to Hartman Street, they want the whole head.
no.
They do?
Yeah.
They won't let you keep the antlers?
Well, that's the
Well,
question.
that's my
My
question.
understanding is that they do that.
Yeah,
You know, there's no one there.
I should have commented on that, because I'm not really up to speed on that stuff. I have just a couple more slides then, if there's any questions. The Wisconsin Historical Society Press, who published the book, would like to know what you think about this presentation. So you can visit their website, that website there. The event ID number for tonight is 6529. And I also have paper copies of the survey back there that you could take, fill out, and then send to Wisconsin Historical Society Press. Next slide. Great. I have a second book, also published by Wisconsin Historical Society Press. Just going to mention, because I have copies of it back there, just to tell you what it's about. But when I was writing for Wisconsin Outdoor News on the deer hunting history, I had a column called History of Field, and I wrote about all sorts of different types of hunting history, waterfowl hunting, and the old resorts, and all those column pieces are included in the book. This book. Slide, please. You go a couple, 2, 3. So, Wisconsin has an incredible outdoor sporting history. There's innovations and things that happened here. You know, we have Ole Evinrude was from Wisconsin. He revolutionized the outboard motor industry. We had multiple wooden boat companies. The Rhinelander Boat Company, still people seek wooden boats made by the Rhinelander Boat Company, and they sell for thousands and thousands of dollars. Just incredible craftsmanship. So this is one thing that the Historical Society Press really supported, is this type of writing, because it's often overlooked by Wisconsin history So that's been my goal. You know, I've talked to a lot of people for these columns that are in the book who remembered things. A lot of people I talked to have passed away, unfortunately, but I'm trying to keep this, you know, out in the forefront, the Wisconsin sporting history. So, slide. Skip over this. A lot of these things are probably familiar to you guys. Like Dwight Eisenhower came to Minocqua quite a bit. He was friends with Howard Young, and they would fish a lot together. Things like that are in the book. Slide. So thanks again. I'm sorry I went so long, but I do have books for sale, 12% off the list price, which is about $3 off each book. Both are the same price, $22. Good Christmas presents. So, thank you.